On looking closer at length. Length is the base unit of, the base unit of length is the meter. And we've looked at the names before, but just to give you a little perspective of how long each of these are, a kilometer is not quite 2/3 of a mile, so that gives you a feel for what it is. A hectometer is a football field plus 1.5 end zones. So it's not quite a full football field goalpost to goalpost. A decameter is about the size of a full mid-size RV, about 34 feet. A meter is, like I say, a little bit longer than a yard, 3.5 inches longer. Decimeter might be a long finger. Centimeter might be the width of a skinny finger, and a millimeter is about the thickness of an apple seed. Now, with all of these measurements, we typically stick with millimeters, centimeters, meters, and kilometers. So millimeters are for really tiny, precise work. Centimeters are for slightly larger. Meters are what we would use for typically feet or yards, and then kilometers is what we usually use for miles. So, that in mind, which of the following units would you use to measure the height of a two-story building? Well, a two-story building's what, 25 feet high, and what we typically think of as feet, we're going to use meters. So it might be 7 or 8 meters high. So the height of a two-story building, we're going to use meters for that. It would just be a very large number if we did millimeters or centimeters. And kilometers, you'd be saying it's like 0.1 kilometers, and that's not very precise. The length of a pencil. Well, pencils are about 10-12 centimeters, so I would probably use centimeters to measure the length of a pencil. The diameter of a pencil is closer to millimeters, maybe 7 or 8 millimeters. Your height, this one is got a little bit of wiggle room in it. If you're looking for something real precise, you might want to say 190 centimeters. Or if you're not looking for that much precision, you could say 1.9 meters. So, depends on how precise you're looking for. The distance from your campus to your home, well, unless you live next door to your campus, it's probably going to be in kilometers. And that's the section on measuring lengths. Area is measured in square units. Now, one thing we should note is that if a centimeter is 10 millimeters, a square centimeter is going to be 10 millimeters times 10 millimeters, or 100 square millimeters. Now, what that means is if we're converting between square millimeters or square centimeters or anything like that, for each jump we make, we're going to have to multiply or divide by the square of the usual 10. So instead of moving 1 decimal place, we'll be moving 2 decimal places. We'll get a table of our units. We've got square kilometer is kilometers is, instead of 1,000 square meters, it's 1,000,000 square meters. And just to give you an idea of how big a square kilometer is, Stamping Ground, Kentucky, population 643, is right at 1 square kilometer. So the size of a small town. A square hectometer is 10,000 square meters, and that's right at the size of 2 football fields. A square decameter, which is 100 meters squared, is the size of a starter house, 1,076 square feet. A square meter is about the size of a large card table, a little bit more than a yard by a yard. A square decimeter, which is 100th of a square meter, is about the size of a 3 by 5 note card. A square centimeter is about a child's footprint, and a square millimeter is about the size of a sesame seed. Now we do have a unit called a hectare. That's a square hectometer. So it is 100 meters by 100 meters. And it is used similar to our acres. 1 hectare is about 2.5 acres. Now when measuring area, we typically stick with square millimeters for really tiny stuff, square centimeters for slightly larger, square meters, square kilometers, and hectares for measuring area. So let's look at a few items and see what we would use to measure them. A tabletop, I'd probably go with square meters. If it's like a dining room table, it might be 1 or 2 square meters. If it's a desk, it might be half of a square meter, but I'd probably go with square meters. A postage stamp. Those are pretty small, like a centimeter by a centimeter or 2 centimeters by 2 centimeters, so I'd probably stick with centimeters squared. Hometown, depends on how big it is. Unless it's smaller than stamping ground, I'd probably stick with square kilometers. A mole on your arm. I hope it's small. Probably go with square millimeters. And finally, the area of your KCTCS campus. That's probably in a couple of acres, so I'd go with hectares. Alright, moving on to volume. In US measurements, we measure volume either dimensionally, like cubic feet, cubic inches, so on, cubic yards, or as cups, quarts, gallons, and so on in volume measures. And just to give you a conversion between the two, a cubic foot is about 7.5 gallons. Similarly, in SI units, volume can be measured in terms of dimensions like cubic centimeters or cubic meters, as well as liters and all the variations on liters, milliliter, centiliter, etc. Now, look at this conversion. 1 cubic centimeter equals 1 milliliter. That's a pretty nice little 1-to-1 ratio. You don't have to go multiplying by 7.4 whatever. Now we should note that 1 cubic centimeter is 10 millimeters by 10 millimeters by 10 millimeters, or 1,000 cubic millimeters. So to convert between units for each jump in column, we need to multiply or divide by the cube that we would usually use. That's 3 decimal places for each jump in units. So let's look at a table. We've got our cubic units in dimensional, and then how that compares to cubic meters. But then we've got our volume measure of liters, and I've got a reference here for us to see about how much that is. 1 cubic kilometer, or 1 billion cubic meters. That's going to be a million liters, or a teraliter. That's about the amount of water, that's the volume of the water in Lake Ontario. So that's quite a bit. A cubic hectometer, which would be a million cubic meters, or a gigaliter, that's about the size of, it's about half the size of the volume of Lake Cumberland. So Lake Cumberland's about 2 hectometers cubed, 2 cubic hectometers. Decameters, a cubic decameter is 1,000 cubic meters, or 1,000 kiloliters, a kiloliter. And there are about 4 decameters cubed of water in Newport Aquarium. A cubic meter, which is 1,000 liters, is about 16 tanks of gas in my van, 264 gallons. A decimeter cubed is 1,000th of a cubic meter, and that is 1 liter. So we've got a conversion there. A decimeter, a cubic decimeter is a liter, and that's about a quart. Centimeter cubed is 1,000,000th of a cubic meter, and that is a milliliter. And to give you some perspective, that's 1/5 of a teaspoon. So 5 milliliters is a teaspoon. Finally, a cubic millimeter is tiny. That's 1,000,000th of a cubic meter. It is 1,000th of a milliliter, and that's less than a drop of water. That is tiny. Now we typically stick with cubic centimeters or cubic meters, or with liters and milliliters for volume measurements. Which of these units would you use to measure the volume of liquid in an eyedropper? Well, a milliliter, we already said 5 is a teaspoon, and eyedroppers probably hold less than a teaspoon, so I'd probably go with milliliters for the liquid in an eyedropper. Bottle of soda. Well, even in the United States, if you've bought a soda lately, you've seen that they come in 1, 2, and 3 liters, or some permutation thereof. Concrete for a driveway. Now typically you might think of that as being in cubic yards, and the analog to that, or the partner to that, would be cubic meters. And finally, a lawnmower engine displacement. Have you ever heard of a lawnmower or a small motorcycle engine? They'll say it's so many cc's. Well, cc is a cubic centimeter.